I'm your host, Grayson Brulte. Welcome to another episode of SAE Tomorrow Today, a show about emerging technology and transit mobility with leaders and innovators to make it all happen. On today's episode, we're absolutely honored to be joined by Jonathan Barentine, Principal Engineer, AVSC. On today's episode, we'll discuss how the AVSC's new best practice defines immediate post-crash behavior for automated driving systems in real-world situations. We hope you enjoy this episode. JB, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Grayson. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here. The AVSC does really good work. You publish best-in-class, best practices, no pun intended on that. And recently, the AVSC released a best practice for automated driving system, dedicated vehicle, immediate post-crash behaviors interactions. That sounds like alphabet soup. Why release this best practice now, and why is it so important?
Yeah, good question. We want to have impact. So thinking about like the timeliness and the relevance of our topics is, of course, really important to us too. You know, I think most importantly, the consortium, our members recognize that there isn't a broad consensus in our industry on post-crash behaviors and interactions for an ADS-DV or automated vehicle. But as you know super well, I'm sure many of our listeners do too, we're seeing an increase in commercial deployment and testing of automated vehicles on public roads. So we, on the AVSC staff side and our membership side, agreed it was really important to help the industry coalesce around, what they as developers or operators and their systems need to do, not only to prevent crashes, which has been a lot of our focus for the past several years, but also to minimize the severity of a crash when it does happen. And a big part of reducing the severity of crash and post-crash incidents is, of course, how the system responds and communicates after a crash. And then, as you probably also know, this topic, post-crash sort of behavior, has gotten a lot of attention in the press and in government in the recent, couple of years. So that attention is a big part of the motivation for us to address the topic too.
If you want to use the term, there's been a spotlight put on the various different scenarios, and certain companies have handled it one way, other companies have handled another way. But you're right, it's out there, and then it gets put in its reports, and it gets picked up in blogs and on social. You're a membership organization, so you're looking at topics. As you clearly said, this is a very timely topic. It's a very important topic. But how do you get your membership base to come together to agree on, okay, this is the topic that we're going to work on a best practice for?
Yeah, cool. That's a kind of a wonky process question. I like that. So we, at least annually, in some formal ways, bring our AVSC staff side, so myself and our executive director, Darcine Foldenauer, bring our membership together to go through a series of kind of suggestion, ranking, and voting processes to figure out what all of our members think is important, how we think the topic might support adoption and responsible deployment of the technology, whether we think all of our different stakeholders will care about the topic, how difficult we think the topic will be to write about and then publish. And that's an opportunity for us to talk about, what's giving the industry heartburn and where can we find alignment across our membership. So those conversations vary each time we have them, but we have them a couple times a year. And this topic was, I think, initially proposed, or the work started in earnest about March 2024 and came out around that time the next year. So it took us about a year to figure out how we wanted to handle it.
If you look at your membership base, you have individuals, and also refer to them as companies, that are developing autonomous trucks, 18-wheelers that go long haul, heavier. And then you have other members that are developing purpose-built vehicles, and other members that are retrofitting vehicles. So if you look at the immediate post-crash behaviors, they're different depending on the vehicle size. So how do you get what's called a collective consciousness where everybody can come together and agree on a best practice, since your members have different commercial objectives, different design objectives, just different business objectives?
Yeah, it's really challenging. And that's a lot of what my job revolves around, actually. As principal engineer for the consortium, while I also bring a lot of my own expertise, I've been in the automated vehicle space for about a decade now. Much of what I do is solicit or elicit the thought of experts from our member organization and help them articulate how they've handled these things or plan to handle these things in their own organization. And then part of my work is translating what they share to the other approaches represented in our consortium. And then ultimately, among other things, I'm responsible for putting together a single voice and a single representation of that group picture. In this particular best practice, part of how we try to address this challenge of kind of variable responses to post crash was by focusing on a framework or kind of a structured, logical question series that a developer or an operator or even the ADS DV itself needs to keep in mind before, during, or after a crash. And so the best practice doesn't specify exactly how a system needs to respond to a crash in every single instance. But we hope if you follow the framework and the sort of structured approach that we've put together in the best practice, that you will choose the right things as a developer or as an automated vehicle.
Well, what the best practice does, it gives a clear path forward, if you want to call it a right way to do things. When you're developing the best practice, so you have industry members. In post-crash, there's a lot of called non-industry partners involved. You have first responders, police officers, insurance companies. Since I know that this best practice is focused on the immediate post-crash behaviors, but did you gather their input, since they will play a significant role one way or another as a scenario? I'll use the scenario or the situation involves.
Yeah. The stakeholders of our publications in general are almost like foremost in our mind throughout the development process for our documents. But in this particular topic, crashes and proper behavior after a crash, the sort of quote stakeholders of the crash are incredibly important. That's really that gets at a lot of the core motivation for writing something on this topic at all. When this topic was first proposed as part of our internal processes, as we do for all of our topics, we discuss the stakeholders of the topic and what they may think about our working on it and maybe the way that we want to work on it. And at that point, we go out to the stakeholders. So in this case, one of the critical ones being first responder emergency services. And we tell them we intend to address this topic. How would they, what would they like us to cover in it? When can we comment or get their comment on it later on in the process? So during research and discovery, we contacted folks. Later on, before publication, in some cases, we check in with stakeholders, and then afterward, we go to conferences and directly engage with stakeholder groups, including first responder organizations. And then I'd be remiss if I didn't add that all of our member organizations regularly engage with, in this case, first responder leadership, teams, unions, organizations to figure out how they ought to be developing and operating their systems. And they brought that expertise to us as part of development of the best practice.
Which makes it really comprehensive. Taking it one step further, how about the suppliers, the tier one suppliers, the braking suppliers, the wire suppliers, because they play very critical roles in some of the way the contracts are structured. Certain component manufacturers have veto rights over deployments. Do you also get input from those key players as well?
Yes, that's, I'll say, especially where our members' expertise and experience really helps us out in the AVSC. But I personally have a lot of engagement with those sorts of perspectives in other standards development contexts, which is a really important part of how we learn about the proper approach and direction for our documents. So while we focus on best practice documents for the most part that represent the best approach our industry has figured out and our members have authored together, we rely on more rigorous standards development processes where a lot of those types of players, manufacturers and OEMs are really, really active. And so that's a place where we can say, hey, we're working on this as practice. We're in this standards committee meeting discussing brake power and command during a crash event. How can we collaborate? So yeah, there are definitely touch points with manufacturers too.
And collaboration's the name of the game, because if you want to put the world's safest product on there, you have to have collaboration, and you also have to have open communication, because when you have collaboration and open communication, really good things happen. And you know that from your role there, JB, in the AVSC. The crashes are complex. There's different scenarios, let's call it different phases during a crash. We don't have to go into all the phases, but this best practice is focused on the immediate post-crash phase. For a listener sitting here says, okay, this is interesting. I understand a fender bender. I understand if I hit somebody. How would you, in very simple terms, describe what is the immediate post-crash?
That's a great question. We, the AVSC, have written a good deal about pre-crash behavior in a number of ways. How automated vehicle systems, what sort of behaviors and maneuvers they take in a variety of different circumstances. And there has been, for reasons you and I discussed a few minutes ago, a lot of attention on post-crash behavior within the industry and around it in the press and in government. So when we sat down metaphorically to discuss how we would like to approach the topic of proper post-crash behavior, we recognized it would be helpful to break the concept of post-crash into a few different buckets, and you find those in the best practice. We're especially focused on the immediate post-crash behaviors and interactions, as opposed to what we call scene management and then post-scene clearance. So, a couple of things on the road bump into each other. Hopefully there isn't too much harm or damage. And then immediately after that, one or both of those, crash actors, they may need to move out of the road or contact other parties. That's all the focus of this best practice. We don't then focus on, although we may in a future document, how do you then go about maybe adding hazard indicators and, like warning cones all around the area where there was an accident. And then after, vehicles maybe have been removed, how do you then, take photos and contact, insurance and things like that. Those are all down the process, but maybe something we write about in the future.
There's a line in the best practice that really stood out to me. I'm going to quote this here directly from there because I want to talk about it. It's very important here. I'm going to quote, end quote. If the ADS is severely damaged, it may limit or prevent the ADS-DV from performing maneuver or non-maneuver behaviors or interactions. Manufacturers, developers, and fleet operators should have an action plan in case the ADS-DV is unable to communicate or interact with vehicle occupants, RO, first responders, or other road users, end quote. What does that action plan look like? Is it old-fashioned? Here's a notebook with paper. Is it digital? Is it something, I'll go high-tech with you, a police officer can tap the side of the vehicle and get an NFC code? What does that action plan look like?
Those are great examples of things that probably are in action plans with our members. This may sound like a little bit of a cop-out, but it's the right answer. It's ultimately up to the organization that is considering how to approach proper post-crash behavior in this sort of scenario. It's important, at least, that there be a plan that plan considers all of the dependencies we've pointed to in our document, whether they're related to the environment of the crash, the actors involved in the crash, like the vehicle that got hit or did the hitting, or the specific circumstances of the crash. So either during design of the system, the automated vehicle system, or in the moments after the crash, the developer and the system have to look at the full spectrum of remaining responses available to them and their maybe off-board support tools in order to reduce risk of something bad happening after the crash. That's one of the primary motivations for a lot of the behaviors and interactions we've described. And so they and the vehicle can appropriately address the needs of all the different stakeholders of a crash. But in that exact specific quote where there's limited communication available to the system, if the ADS-DV is having a bad time signaling in some way to the other actors involved in the crash, that means the sort of spectrum of responses, the options available to the system in order to reduce risk of of further damage or harm is more limited. And so the action plan needs to reflect that. I guess I should say this whole emphasis on an action plan really calls to mind for me the importance of safety management generally, and in particular, the importance of having and designing a good safety management system. In some ways, safety management is all about proactively identifying and then solving for potential safety issues, or at least having a plan for managing those issues when they arise. And that's sort of the spirit of the language that you quoted.
How much of safety management goes to the culture of the company?
It starts with the culture. I love this question. I am many things automated vehicles, but safety management systems and safety culture is probably most of where I get motivated to do my work. It's truly fundamental. It requires at least a commitment from the movers and decision makers at the company to prioritize safety. And that sounds sort of glib, but it's happening when you see hard choices being made on balance favoring safety. And the design of the safety management approach in the company or of the vehicle will show that.
If you look at a company that's done it right, and he's a member of yours and he's a personal friend of mine, is Nat Buse. And when you talk to Mr. Buse, he talks about it's the culture of safety. Every individual, he goes, it's not just the individuals working on the trucks. He goes, it's the janitors, it's the individuals that check you in. And he gives this entire holistic approach. And you talk to Mr. Buse and he'll say, the first thing you do when you join Aurora, you go to a safety briefing and you learn, because it's ingrained there in the culture as your best practices come out. And I emphasize that plural. This is not just a one-off. You have multiple best practices. What sort of training do your member companies do? Is it ongoing training to prepare for these new best practices, or what does that look like?
Really cool question. I love that you brought up Aurora and their safety culture. I'm a proud former staffer of the Aurora team and also know Nat. And I couldn't agree more with the sentiments you just shared about their culture. For our members, the sort of presumption is that they already embody in practice what we capture in our best practices, or they are committed to exhibiting those best practices in due course. That's why we rely, one of the many reasons we rely so critically on their expertise to develop our work. We should be, in most cases, writing down what they have already figured out and worked really hard to understand. So in that way, there shouldn't be a need in every case for a lot of training. But there are cases where we represent best practices that are not yet relevant to or possible for some of our members because of their commercial plans or just the status of their system development. And so in those cases, it's part of the commitment our members make that they figure out what they have articulated in our documents and then plan to act accordingly. It's such an important commitment, actually, that a number of our members voluntarily do self-assessments against our best practice and information reports. And some of, actually, I would say all of them do that. And then some of them also engage third-party auditors and assessors to help them check against their own commitments. So yeah, they really believe in embodying and acting in accordance to our documents.
And that's how you build trust at the end of the day. So you have a document to reference, and then you have an auditor that's audited it, and that helps build trust with the regulators, and to some degree it helps build trust with the public, because without trust, none of this scales. When you're in a post crash, and let's say the plan kicks in, how much of that is automated, where it just kind of just goes like clockwork, or is it, I know I'm going to sound, we're going to play telephone. So you're in the JB call so-and-so, we have this game of telephone. How much of it's automated?
Well, ideally a good bit of it. And that's because, the part of the spirit of all the work of this industry is to use the latest and greatest technology to reduce the burden on humans to do this sort of work. But it will depend on a myriad of things. And the best practice tries to articulate a few different ways of looking at that myriad of things that influence whether the response is automated. In particular, we've got these three different types of dependencies. There's environmental dependencies, the actor dependencies. So where did the crash happen? What does that sort of environment look like? Who's involved in it or who could be involved in it soon? And then last, the specifics of it. So, what type of vehicle, how was it moving, who's in the vehicle, that sort of stuff. And the answers to questions that we pose in our best practice about those three dependencies will, in many ways, illuminate or answer to what extent the response can be automated.
If you have an individual that's in the vehicle and the vehicle is involved in a crash, is there a redundant cellular or redundant system to notify that individual of what's going on so they're not just staring at a blank screen and trying to figure out, okay, now what's going on? Is there redundant systems that can notify and they can ask a simple question, are you okay?
In many cases, yes. I think our members have different versions of their own systems that have different approaches to what we would call human-machine interface to communicate about the human factors of a crash. However, redundancy is important for a few reasons. One is just to make sure that if one approach that the system may take to communicate something is unavailable or fails, that there ought to be another. And similarly, we as humans have different needs for our communication. So I know many of our members do really serious human factors and HMI analysis design work to figure out how to better communicate with people that have different, communication needs. Not everyone can visually read the screens in some of our members' systems, so they may have haptic feedback systems in place or auditory ones, or the other way around. And that's true for communicating with other actors outside of the vehicle in some cases too.
What if there's a vulnerable road user, such as an individual on a bike or a pedestrian? How does that change the best practice, or what the best practice recommends from a response standpoint?
Yeah, the AVSC and the industry at large place a really great emphasis on actors on the road involved in a crash or not that are not in a metal frame vehicle. They're much more vulnerable, of course. So the way the best practice tries to guide the reader is by asking and then answering a series of questions about the actors involved. And if a non-vehicle actor is involved, then some of the responses available to the system, or kind of the onus on the system, changes. It's really important, for instance, that there is some check the status of the other actors involved in a crash afterward. And that's indicated in some ways in our best practice. That's especially important if you're in a crash with a non-vehicle road user.
Since there's not an individual in the vehicle, your members are operating fully autonomous, does it turn on live stream where somebody in a command center can get an understanding of what's going on and then communicate that to perhaps the first responder that's on their way to the scene and say, sir, X, Y, and Z has happened, and then perhaps, I know I'm crossing a line here, but it's going to happen at some point, patch in law enforcement where they can see a live stream of that. Is that in the best practice?
Yes, it's in several places pointed out that communication with what the best practice will often just call an RO, a remote operator, is an important part of the flow. Generally, just calling upon remote assistance is important. And if that's not available to the system because of some characteristic of the crash itself, then that's an important part of the framework and kind of logical process that we put together in a document. At any rate, yes, communication with other parts of the developer or operator enterprise is a really big part of post-crash response.
And then if you look at, we all talk about them, we've debated them for years, edge cases. Everybody has a different edge case. There was the famous Waymo one with the ducks crossing the road from years and years ago. There's one that, doing research for this, I didn't realize how many planes crash or land on roads in America. It was shockingly more common than I would have ever thought. How does that change the best practice, since that is, for all practical purposes, an edge case?
Yes, definition of edge case is a fun and spicy topic, as you know. But yeah, a plane landing on a highway is in some ways reasonably foreseeable. It's definitely something that some of our members that are very highway focused have had to consider. I don't know if they've had to interact with it. I'll have to follow up with a few of them. But they, in any case, an edge case like that, I think there are some pretty obvious impacts on the dependencies I've pointed out that are fun to think about. But generally, the best practice says that the reader needs to consider a series of questions about how a plane landing on the highway would impact those three types of sort of characteristics of the crash, those three dependency groups. But yeah, a plane landing on the highway, it would in some ways seriously change the environment of the crash scene. It would definitely have an impact on the available behaviors available to the ADS DV. Changing lanes or pulling out of the shoulder might not be available depending on the size of the plane. And I can imagine there being exhaust or sort of sensory interference because of wind or dust or heat from the jet engines, and that's a wild one to consider. It would definitely impact all of those dependencies that we've been talking about.
Especially as autonomous trucking scales up and robotaxis get to the highways, it's going to happen at some point. I'm not wishing anybody, but if you just look at statistics, we know it's going to happen. So if you look at the different scenarios, so you have crash scenarios that are in cities with passenger cars, and you have crash scenarios on highways that can involve trucks or passenger cars. What are the major differences? Obviously, if you're an 18-wheeler, your stop time's a lot longer. The weight of the vehicle there, the ability to maneuver as quickly is slower. What are some of those main scenarios, and how are you dealing with those scenarios in the best practice?
That's a great question, and it really gets at the diversity of our members and their different systems. So the best practice tries to place I think successfully places a good emphasis on the sort of contextual dependence of what we've been calling these dependencies, and that these dependencies include things like surrounding infrastructure. So if you're considering a pass car crash in a city, for instance, it may be possible to pull into a nearby parking lot after a crash, which could be useful to reduce the likelihood of other road actors getting involved in the actors that are involved in the first crash. But that's, pulling into a parking lot is not nearly as likely if you're on a highway or using a commercial truck, because highways don't tend to have parking lots next to them and commercial trucks tend to be pretty large. So those sorts of factors, that what we've been calling dependencies, are really critical. That's true for other types of dependencies. So that was sort of an environmental dependency, but the actor dependencies and the sort of circumstantial dependencies are really important too. Other road users are really significantly different if you look at an urban environment, highway scenarios. So you probably aren't expecting a number of bicyclists or jaywalking pedestrians if you're on a highway. That's definitely what you need to consider if you're in an urban environment. On the highway, the speeds, the vehicle sizes, and therefore the sort of potential impact severity are sometimes much larger than if when you're looking at urban environments. And at any rate, all of these different dependencies influence the options available to the automated vehicle system when it figures out what to do or what not to do after a crash. Looking at trucks, passenger cars in those two different environments was a really constant and regular part of the conversation within the consortium as we worked on this document.
Several of your members, I've been in their trucks or operating and testing Dallas to Houston. And I've seen some weird edge cases. There was one gentleman riding a bike, and apparently the safety engineer, so that's common, we see him all the time. And then I saw a sign that said, going by prison, do not pick up anybody. They could be criminals. Like, okay, this is just the stuff you see on the roads, because that raises the question, does local laws, do they have any impact on the best practice? So obviously, in that scenario, you have to abide the law from what the sign says. You got to keep on trucking. No pun intended. What impact do local laws have on the implementation of the best practice?
They have a significant impact. Those are really funny examples. Yeah, so the best practice states in a few places explicitly that local traffic laws must be followed. There are a few places, at least one I can remember off the top of my head, where we express that local and national regulations need to be conferred with and then complied with. And we were deliberately not specific about any jurisdictions rules because our members are diverse. They're in many places and the rules vary really significantly. The rules here in Pittsburgh, where I live, are very different than in some of the big southwestern places where a lot of our members operate, for instance. But the point is, we do explicitly call out the need for legal compliance several places in the best practice. I think one example I can think of, when we address the use of hazard lights after a crash, we explicitly call upon checking with local and potentially national rulemaking bodies about what's required in that area. We also do a great deal of work as a consortium, as AVSC staff, and through our members to engage with regulatory bodies and with rulemakers to get their input, what we should cover and how we should cover it at various stages in our development process, before, during, and after publication.
Well, that goes back to the whole culture of collaboration and open communications. As I said earlier, that's how really good things happen. JB, in your opinion, how would you like to see this best practice rolled out, implemented, and most importantly, as your members care, scaled? How would you like to see this scaled?
Yes, great question. Scale is important. We write these things and publish them so that they get used and they have influence. So, I think it's important to keep in mind that our currently eight member organizations already do or are working on the things in our best practice. That's baked into our ethos and internal processes. We talked about that a little bit earlier. When I think about the rest of the world, though, I guess a few points come to mind. First, it's important that we in the consortium and peer development and standards groups and the listener of the show keep in mind that our documents are living documents. We do the best we can, and we go through really intense voting processes and reviews internally before we publish our work. But we keep up with the comments of the public or government or standards organizations and safety advocates, and we revisit our work. So we're not a standards organization on purpose, although we're connected to one, and we work with a number of them, because we want to be able to put papers out at a quicker pace and then revisit them and iterate on them pretty rapidly. Or work to have them be deprecated because they get absorbed into a more formal standard. Another point is that accessibility to our work is really important. We require some pretty rigorous stuff internally of our members and of our staff before we publish something. But once it's published, we make it available freely. We want people to be able to access it, read it, share it. And then the last thing that comes to mind is policy and standards. I mentioned that we work with standards organizations so that our thought gets codified in a slightly more rigorous way. But we also work with rulemakers and policy leaders across the states or other markets. And we really try to support their work based on our work. It's a big part of how we prioritize continuous improvement as well. We look for their feedback very regularly. So in addition to our members continuing to follow our best practices or working to follow them, those are some of the things I think about with scale and rollout.
Since the AVSC documents are living documents, how often are they updated? Do the members come together to vote, to say, okay, we'd like to pursue an update to say, document 1? Or how does that process look to update these documents?
It's complicated in a good way. We, on the AVSC staff side, we look out for developments in regulations and, policy corpus and other standards and try to proactively find areas of improvement or revision to our work. And we will bring proposed revisions to our members on our own. That's something that we try to do continuously, especially when we're maybe in a sort of a quieter part of our best practice development period. Let's say we had just sent a new major draft to our members for their review. We might have a few weeks before we're expecting all of their full review and critique to come back. And that would be a good time for us to look back at some of our older materials. We also regularly elicit thoughts from our members about which of our previous documents could be due for revision. They're plugged into a lot of places that we aren't, or they have different perspectives on those places. As an example, we are planning to likely deprecate our publication on operational design domain at some point later this year or maybe next year, depending on the progress of some work in the ORAD committee with SAE. They're working to largely incorporate our text, which would mean we could say, you can read this, if you're interested, but please go see this new thing over at SAE. But yeah, that's a lively, constant part of the workflow for the AVSC.
You're busy. You're very busy tackling ODD. Wow, the votes on that are going to be very interesting and how you're going to come to technical definitions. I wish you a lot of luck with that.
Thanks. Yeah, it's fun stuff to chew on. So
this was a fun conversation, JB. Learned a lot. Really big fan of the work that the entire AVSC committee is doing, both the members and the staff. As we look to wrap up this insightful conversation for today, what would you like our listeners to take away with them?
Thanks for the question. I really appreciate it. I think if I try to distill what the working group we assembled from our member organizations really wanted to convey to the public through this best practice, it's probably just a few things. First, that there are 3 types of dependencies that influence how an automated vehicle system may respond to a crash immediately after the crash. Those dependencies are important both for the developer and for the ADS itself to consider during design and then operation of the system. And the AV needs to be developed and operated in ways that allow for careful consideration and response to all of those different, those dependencies, those 3 types of dependencies. And then the other thing I would want to convey is that there isn't a single best way to handle a crash. I think it often seems obvious when handling a crash doesn't look correct, but the factors and the dependencies are seemingly infinite in their variance, and so it's really important to have a structured, reasonable, and transparent approach to figuring all that variance out. I guess another fun little point for the listener: some people may not be familiar with reading documents like this, legal or standards documents. So as you read, I recommend placing special emphasis wherever we say things like should or must, as opposed to may or might. If we say should or must, that's something we basically consider law. It's a kind of a commandment. So pay special attention to those.
The documents, if you're in the industry, are well worth it because you can learn a lot. You can see the commitment that this industry has to safety and doing things the right way. And furthermore, what AVSC is doing with this industry is building transparency. And when you have transparency, you have trust. Today is tomorrow. Tomorrow is today. The future is AVSC best practices. JB, thank you so much for coming on SAE Tomorrow Today.
Thanks, Grayson. Really good time talking with you.
Thank you for listening to SAE Tomorrow Today. Be sure to join us next week for another episode of Tomorrow Today Unplugged.
SAE International makes no representations as to the accuracy of the information presented in this podcast. The information and opinions are for general information only. SAE International does not endorse, approve, recommend, or certify any information, product, process, service, or organization presented or mentioned in this podcast.